We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program. He is a writer for grist.org and just back from Paris. Ben Adler, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ben, let's just set the context before. Obviously, you were in Paris. You were reporting on this agreement. Before we actually speak about the agreement itself, just set the context. How did we end up getting to Paris, and compare and contrast, if you will, Kyoto, which, as far as I can tell, was sort of the last model for something like what we saw in Paris this week?
Right. So in 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was negotiated and signed. That's the treaty that set up this framework under which countries come together once a year to discuss modifications and updates. An important point here is that those modifications and updates, which the Paris Agreement is a big collection of, are not treaties in themselves and do not require Senate ratification. Kyoto was the sort of first big effort to actually bring countries together with binding emissions target reductions. Now, under U.S. law, if the U.S. is going to enter into a treaty with binding or an agreement with binding emissions cuts, that crosses the threshold into being a treaty and requires Senate ratification. And the Senate, of course, did not ratify Kyoto, nor did the U.S. or most countries that had agreed to greenhouse gas emissions reductions under Kyoto meet those promises. So Kyoto was something of a failure. It also only required developed countries to cut their emissions, which made a lot more sense in 1997 than it would today, with the explosive growth of economic activity, population, and emissions in China in particular, but also other countries in Latin America and Asia. So the reason the Paris Agreement is a big step forward is that all 196 countries agreed to that it is all of their responsibility to combat climate change. Everyone has a responsibility to limit emissions and ultimately move away from fossil fuels. Or actually, in the language of the agreement, decarbonize. Decarbonize the language activists wanted. Net zero carbon emissions is what the goal is laid out. So in theory, you could also achieve that through some technology that's
so decarbonize as opposed to net zero emissions. What is the difference there?
So the more progressive environmental activists and sort of human rights activists, indigenous groups would prefer language that called for decarbonizing or getting rid of fossil fuels, because they don't just want to stop climate change from getting worse, they also want to get away from extracting fossil fuels out of the ground, and burning them, which has other environmental and economic and social negative consequences. Other countries and there are a lot of countries that would have been happy to agree to that, right? And say we're going to be we want the world economy to be powered by entirely renewable energy by the end of the century or something like that. But then you have countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, that draw heavily, economically from extracting oil and selling it. And their argument is, in terms of climate change, it's not really, who cares about oil per se, it's just the net increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that causes warming that we are concerned about. So we could just solve this problem, hopefully, maybe by, planting enough trees to suck up all the carbon dioxide.
Okay.
So let's just say net carbon and zero, and that's what they ended up having to. The thing about the language here is it's passed unanimously, so everyone you have to come up with things that keep everyone sufficiently happy to stay on board.
Do we have that? I mean, and I can understand their argument. Like your problem isn't with fossil fuels per se. Your problem is what the implications of burning those fossil fuels are. And if we can just solve the implications, then we're fine from the perspective of Saudi Arabia or Texas or North Dakota, let's say.
Right.
But do we really have that capacity? I mean, it's one thing to say like, well, we actually have a plan right here where but there isn't. I mean, that's part of the problem, right? Is that like that part about where you can deal with the implications of burning fossil fuel and not have to worry about fossil fuel per se. That's part right, because it's sort of a myth, right? I mean, that's like clean coal.
Yeah, exactly. The problem is that the technology to suck carbon out of the air, safely transport it to somewhere you can store it permanently underground. Permanently, it has to never come out, right? And do that in a way that is cheaper than just switching to solar and wind and hydro, or just like, being more efficient and using less energy. It just hasn't happened, and it probably won't. The other thing is, and if it does, great. I mean, the thing is, in a weird way, it's like they're both right.
Right.
I mean, part of what the Paris Agreement is going to do is encourage countries to come up with ways of stopping deforestation and hopefully promoting reforestation, because trees are carbon sinks. Now, that's great, right? I mean, trees are good for a whole bunch of reasons, and it's totally valid to say we are going to realistically be using some fossil fuels for the time being, and so we should offset their carbon emissions as much as possible by improving the cover of trees and grasslands and other carbon sinks. But ultimately, there's only so much fossil fuels in the world. And ultimately, we can't have a global economy powered by these finite resources. We need renewable resources, or else we're going to see eventually prices spike. We're going to see conflicts over the, access to those resources. I mean, I'm saying this like it's a future thing. We already see this. That's why we have all these troops in the Middle East in part, right? So clearly we do need to move away from fossil fuels ultimately. And the other thing is, and again, like this comes down to a matter of perspective. Everyone, no matter how much they don't really care about the environment, with the exception of the Republican Party, every major party or government in the world accepts the fact that climate change is happening. It's going to be bad. It's going to be, no matter how callous you are about the human suffering, it's going to cause economic damage. So we have to address that. But then a lot of people, and I'm openly in this camp myself, think that like conventional pollutants that cause asthma and people to cough and choke. You look at the smog in Beijing or Delhi or sometimes even LA is a bad thing too, right? And so burning oil and coal and ruining areas where we extract those things, and oil spills and all these things are also bad, and we'd be better off getting away from them.
So you're one of those people who don't think that having asthma builds character. Is that what you're saying?
No, I have a disagreement with the Koch brothers about this.
Okay. All right. Well, fair enough. But wait, I want to, it's weird, but as you say to me, like this idea that the Republican Party is literally the only major political party in the world that does not that refutes the idea of climate change and it being man-made. Is that, I mean, I don't know that I've ever really sort of like concentrated on that concept. I sort of glibly may have said that myself, but is that actually the case? I mean, is there literally?
Yes, it is. I mean,
that's sort of stunning when you think about it.
In the world, there's 196. I was just in Paris. There are 196 governments there. I watched the heads of state speak. They accept climate science. That doesn't mean they're all nice progressives.
Well, like North Korea,
right? Vladimir Putin,
right? North Korea.
Right. Yeah.
North Korea is fighting climate change.
North Korea totally accepts, they accept climate science. And in fact, I just saw a story the other day that they might try and work on some partnerships with South Korea on some of this. But like, let's take Vladimir Putin, who has generally been one of the worst, and is in a sense a very right-wing figure.
Right.
And in fact, sort of, the Republicans in this weird way to sort of have this crush on him because he's such a manly man. And,
he's very manly. Let's be honest.
He acts, and Russia, by the way, also has a ton of gas and oil, right? And it's really essential to their economy. And Putin pillages, steals the wealth for himself, and he's got a lot of reasons to deny climate science. And in the past, sort of has, but he has shifted to fully accepting climate science. He made a speech in which he calls it the greatest threat to human existence or something in Paris. Now, Russia still has lousy policies on climate change relative to other developed countries, but he doesn't deny the empirical fact that the Earth is getting warmer and is causing things like glaciers melting, and he doesn't deny the overwhelming scientific consensus that is caused by greenhouse gas emissions.
I mean,
no government in the world does.
It's so stunning to think of that. I mean, somebody should be making a video right now of 191 heads of states around the world just acknowledging the existence of climate science. And then, once you get through every tiny little, country or places that we perceive as being completely backward, and then we just get to the House of Representatives in the United States and the U.S. Senate and get to the Republicans. All right, so that's the backdrop, and so we go into this. We go into Paris, and give us a sense of. I mean, my sort of broadly speaking, my sense is that activists and environmentalists and people in the know of this stuff, and policy experts, and I guess really, everybody who agrees in climate change, so the entire world except for a major political party of this country, perceive these talks and this agreement as sort of being akin to, and you tell me if this metaphor makes sense. We've agreed that the house may be on fire. We've agreed to build the fire station. We have ordered the parts for the fire trucks. We're just not going to send them out quite yet.
That's a good analogy.
And it's there so that when things get really, really bad, we've at least got the mechanism to fight the fire. Is that like a fair assessment, broadly speaking, for a layperson?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, it's exactly right about about the part that we built the framework that could allow. The reason some people would say this is a huge success is because we finally established a framework in which every country in the world shares responsibility for reducing emissions and averting catastrophic climate change. And if the countries, what we haven't agreed to is making the kinds of no one has agreed to making the kinds of cuts necessary to actually get there, though. And so the question is, but the big success is, I actually think your analogy really holds up well, because the big success in the agreement is that, which we were unsure of coming in, was that we got everyone to agree that the pledges that countries made for emissions cuts go from 2020 to 2030. We are going to need bigger emissions cuts in that decade, not just after it, if we're going to stay below 2 degrees Celsius of warming over pre-industrial levels. So the big success was we got everyone to agree to come back in 2020 and hopefully pledge then bigger cuts between 2025 and 2030, and then come back every 5 years thereafter and keep strengthening the emissions cuts. And if you were to ask, well, why would they come back with stronger emissions cuts in 5 years? There's one aspect of it that you sort of left out, which is that once we begin down that path, we'll find hopefully that it's easier and and everyone trusts that everyone else is playing along. But the other thing, which is I think the part that you were referring to, is climate change keeps getting worse.
Right.
So people will have a sense of urgency in 5 years after there's been more, like another Hurricane Sandy type event
right.
In your country, then you will be more willing to do more about it. You'll have more political will in your country to do it, or just more of a sense of urgency in your own self-interest. So that's the hope, and that's the process that's been set up. Of course, if the Republican Party wins the presidential election next year, then they're not very likely to come back in 2020 and say, yeah, the U.S. is going to make bigger cuts. And the U.S., being the world's largest economy, is currently the second largest emitter, and historically the largest emitter by far, cumulatively. It's really important that the U.S. does its fair share and makes the biggest cuts. And so if President Cruz is in the White House in 2020, that's going to be a major stumbling block.
But I mean, the upside is we'll have defeated the war on PC, so that we will have that going for us. All right, but so we've gone over this notion of the ratchet mechanism, right? That is the coming back every 5 years. The sort of like it's basically to I guess to belabor my analogy. We've built the firehouse. We're going to come back in 5 years just to see how much of the town is burnt down at that point, and maybe we'll send the fire trucks out. And the other thing in your reporting that you've written is that developed countries or richer developing countries have started to contribute to climate finance. So that's countries that maybe at the time of the Kyoto Accords didn't have the resources and hadn't moved along in their economies to be able to contribute to this fight. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, exactly. So if you look back at GDP per capita in the 1990s for countries like China or South Korea or Singapore, it was much, much lower than it was anywhere in like Europe or, the U.S. So they were simply put in the same category of developing countries that receive climate finance rather than contributing it. But now, South Korea, for example, is richer than a lot of countries in Eastern Europe. And it just doesn't make sense to leave it in the same category as countries in like sub-Saharan Africa or South Asian countries that are just much, much less money. So, but the thing is, those countries were really resistant to being formally moved into a new category of developed countries that are now on the hook. And so instead, they settled on this compromise language of developed countries have this responsibility to donate to climate finance, and other countries that are willing and able to do so, or something to that effect. And there's actually something to be said for that, because it also leaves open the possibility of countries, their circumstances evolve, and other countries, unforeseen countries, may in 5 or 10 years be rich enough to start contributing to climate finance as well. And we want everyone to pitch in.
So if I hear what you're saying, is
that's a huge issue.
Instead of having making it a category change, you basically open up all categories of these countries to sort of have some measure of responsibility. There's a little wiggle room there.